This section is dedicated to the study of the problem of obesity. It is found in your textbook, Nutrition for Healthcare Professionals, 3rd edition. There are also a set of questions at the end of the chapter to help you study. The prevalence of obesity is staggering. About 73.6% of adult Americans are overweight or obese, and as many as 41.9% are considered obese, and this is up from about 39.8% in 2016. So if the trend continues by 2030, some fear the obesity will reach 47%. Also alarming is the prevalence of obesity and overweight among children. 35.4% of children and adolescents are either overweight or obese, and this carries significant repercussions. This sizable increase in the prevalence of obesity and overweight in the U.S. population since the late 1970s carries a heavy price tag. The national health expenditure in 2017 was $3.5 trillion. This was a sizable increase from the $256 billion in 2010. The literature tells us that the causes of obesity are multifactorial, beginning with the food environment, the built environment, medical issues and genetic issues, and of course, the satiety mechanisms in our own body, those mechanisms that control our appetite and our sense of being full. I would like to first make some points about the food environment. When we talk about the food environment, we're essentially speaking about the quality, quantity, and types of food that we find in our grocery stores, in our convenience stores, and in the environment that we're living in. We also talk about the food environment as being a product of the economic conditions that we might be living in as well. In underdeveloped countries, for instance, where there is primarily a cash crop and a disappearance of sustainable agriculture, it means that there's a more narrow type of food production that is used for export, which invariably means that the country in question has to import most of its food to feed its population. It also means that in our global economy that there is an increased availability of cheap, processed, affordable foods, notably oils and meats, have actually gained access to a lot of developing countries, bringing with it a lot of caloric density and consequently an increase in obesity. In our country, the United States, the food environment is really about the snackification of food. We've become a snacking nation since the 1980s, consequently eating frequently and eating processed foods in large portion sizes with a lot of fat and calories. And consequently, here also in the United States, we have an obesity problem because of the easy access to abundant, high caloric density, poor nutrient density foods. Next, I want to make a few points about the built environment in which we live and how it influences obesity. When we talk about the built environment, we really refer to the increase in urbanization when we speak of this globally. Increased urbanization means decreased reliance or decreased agricultural terrain, and it also means then that fewer people are involved in the activity of being farmers and of working hard to develop the land, to produce the crops, to feed the population. We're currently living in a country where very few are producing the food for very many. And as a result of this, our energy expenditure is significantly lower than if we compare it back to the 1930s and the 40s. And so this built environment really means a reliance on an urban center and on mechanization. So we see transportation, we see buses and automobiles, and we see manufacturing, and we see access to cheaper food and abundant food as a result of this built environment that produces things so cheaply. We also see increased female labor force, and we see as a result of this less meals at home. So that means a reliance on more food away from home, and it also refers to cheaper food. And studies have shown that in these circumstances, when meals are not consumed together in the household, there's a lower quality of food consumed by the family. The genetic and medical issues that are tied to obesity are actually relatively rare when we look at the overall prevalence of obesity in the population, but they nevertheless allow us to understand some very specific and interesting mechanisms, which we'll explore. The first genetic cause that I want to pay attention to is Prader-Willi syndrome. There's more written about Prader-Willi syndrome in the textbook, but I want to highlight the fact that the syndrome is basically originating from a defect in the father's genetics, and it's characterized by an early obesity, an insatiable appetite, and a mental retardation. And so, this is the characteristic that causes these young people to basically eat insatiably. Very difficult to limit their appetite. There are cases quite frequently of parents who have children with this syndrome that actually have to lock the refrigerator and the pantry so that they're not accessing these foods after hours. Now, interestingly, when the defect is coming from the mother, it's called Engelmann syndrome, and it's characterized by a more severe mental retardation, but without having any obesity. The next syndrome that I want to talk about is Bardet-Biedl, and it too is characterized by a mental retardation and a series of other anomalies that are nicely described in the textbook, but notably also obesity. Now, the next one I want to talk about is Alström-Hellgren syndrome. Now, it resembles Bardet-Biedl in the sense that it has obesity and also is characterized by blindness. But to distinguish it, it also has deafness, diabetes, and there is a clear absence here of mental retardation in this particular syndrome compared to Bardet-Biedl. Now, leptin is a hormone secreted from the adipose tissue. The greater the amount of adipose tissue, the greater the leptin in circulation. And the leptin has a specific role in, shall we say, countering the appetite or shutting down the appetite. So the larger the amount of obese tissue, the larger the leptin concentration in the blood, and theoretically, the greater the repression of appetite. Now, in leptin deficiency, consequently, which was documented in the 90s in rats, and also in Pakistani cousins back in around 1997. And the deficiency basically means a total absence of leptin, which means no production of a key indicator to suppress appetite. So consequently, in the absence of leptin, these cousins in these Pakistani cousins, I should say, did not have any indicator to shut down their appetite, so they had an insatiable appetite and consequently gained tremendous amount of weight. Their weight was reversed by providing them with leptin injections, and consequently, without changing anything in their environment and in their eating habits, they gradually lost over 100 pounds to come down to a more manageable weight size. The last cause of obesity is a defect in the satiety mechanisms. Now, the Satiety mechanisms are divided into different categories. There are the homeostatic mechanisms, and there's long-term regulation within the homeostatic mechanism, which is, regulated by insulin and leptin, and then the short-term regulation by ghrelin, peptide YY, cholecystokinin, glucagon-like peptides. So in addition to the homeostatic mechanism, there's the cortical limbic neural network. This network is responsible for stimulating the hedonic center, or in other words, the pleasure center of the brain, to which, addiction to food has been attributed. So now the first satiety mechanism I'd like to look at is the long-term regulation of the homeostatic mechanism. So what I'm about to describe is how insulin and leptin maintain a balanced adiposity in the body over the long term. So now I want to first discuss insulin. Insulin is a hormone secreted by the beta cells of the pancreas in response to the intake of sugar primarily. When sugar in the form of glucose is absorbed into the gut, it then needs to move from the gut into the enterocytes, and from the enterocytes into the blood, and then circulating in the blood, it gets picked up by various tissues, the muscle tissue and the adipose tissue, with the help of insulin. So insulin is like a transporter that helps the sugar move into muscle cell and also into adipose tissue. When there is abundant amount of sugar coming into the diet, insulin hyperreacts, and there's a lot of insulin that gets secreted from the pancreas, and it favors an overabundant intake or access of the sugar into the liver, for example, where it can actually synthesize fat, and also into adipose tissue. So when there's an abundant amount of adipose tissue or fat being produced, there is, as a result, in many individuals, but not all, an insulin resistance. And this insulin resistance appears to be directly related to the amount of fat that is actually stored in the body. So when you get beyond a certain cutoff of fat, the insulin stops to be effective. The result of that is higher blood sugars in the blood. So this is an indication here of a long-term mechanism for balance that actually goes awry when there is excessive amount of fat in the body. So now let's take a look at leptin. Now, leptin is a hormone also secreted, in this case, from the adipose tissues primarily. And the amount of leptin secreted into the blood from the adipose tissue increases as the size of the adipose tissue, or of the fat cells, or the number of fat cells, increase in the body. So the more you're fat, the more leptin is secreted. Now, leptin acts on the hypothalamus, notably on the ventral medial center, which is appetite control. And when leptin levels are high, secreted from high levels of body fat, it basically shuts off or brings down the appetite. So it's a way to control the appetite. So this long-term mechanism is really very much tied with the balance of body fat in the body. So under normal circumstances, leptin levels are at a certain level when body fat is normal. And when body fat increases, leptin levels go up, and it's supposed to stop the appetite, and the person then self-corrects in their eating behaviors, eat less food until the body fat levels come back down, and with it the leptin levels, therefore giving room for a better appetite to eat again. What happens in obesity, however, when the fat cells are very numerous, leptin levels go up, but they cease to be effective in shutting off the appetite. So there is some kind of a leptin resistance that takes place when obesity reaches a certain level. But for the most part, for people who do not have what appears to be exaggerated amounts of body fat, the leptin is a good way to control the appetite. Fat levels increase in the body, leptin goes up, shuts off the appetite. We eat less until our body fat levels come back down. So it's a normal long-term homeostatic mechanism for body fat control. Well, now I want to turn our attention towards the short-term regulation of appetite inside the body, looking at ghrelin, peptide YY, cholecystokinin, and glucagon-like peptides. So let's begin the discussion. So the premise of the short-term regulation is tied to short-term food consumption. So the first that we're going to look at here is the hormone ghrelin, which is secreted by the stomach. When the stomach is empty, there are higher concentrations of ghrelin secreted from the stomach into the blood circulation, which then goes to the brain to signal that there's sort of a higher appetite drive. So the drive here then is to increase food consumption when ghrelin concentrations are elevated, which is when the stomach is empty. When you eat the food, ghrelin concentrations decrease because now the stomach is now fuller. With a decreased ghrelin, there is a decrease in appetite as well. Well, the next set of hormones, peptide YY, cholecystokinin, and glucagon-like peptides, are known as gut hormones. This means they're secreted by the gastrointestinal tract. Now, this is how it works. When food is consumed, these hormones are secreted in greater concentrations, causing the appetite then to decrease. So now that we've looked at the homeostatic mechanism, let's look at the corticolimbic neural network. This is the network that is responsible for stimulating the pleasure centers of the brain, called the hedonic center, found in the frontal lobe of the brain. It's stimulated by serotonin, by dopamine. So then, when we eat a pleasurable food, the corticolimbic neural network stimulates abundant dopamine that stimulates the hedonic receptors in the brain, causes us a great deal of pleasure. This is associated with the pleasurable experience of dining. Let me illustrate how powerful this corticolimbic neural network really is. When you visit your grandmother for Thanksgiving and she offers you a lot of turkey and you eat to your complete satisfaction, and say to grandmother, I couldn't possibly eat another bite, but she decides to offer you a pumpkin pie at the end of the meal. Oftentimes the decision is to override that sense of fullness in order to have that taste experience of the apple pie. This is when the corticolimbic neural network kicks in. We want to experience the pleasure of eating that pumpkin pie. Consequently, it makes a lot of sense that the main medical therapeutic modality is actually appetite control. Here are the main obesity treatments that are now considered by the field of medicine and nutrition. Diet restrictions are still the most prominently used strategies. The second, soon to become the first, is pharmacotherapy, the use of drugs to suppress appetite. Third is exercise. Fourth is behavioral therapy. And bariatric surgeries are the last measure, but gaining in popularity and in effectiveness. These different areas are extensively covered in the textbook, starting in section 3.4 on obesity treatments, page 81, all the way to page 87. I encourage students to read this section extensively and to get a really comprehensive understanding of how these therapies work and how the field of nutrition and of medicine consider the effectiveness of these particular approaches. Now, in assessing obesity, but in addition to other medical problems, nutritional assessment, looked at as a broad strategic approach, is very important. Carried out by the dietitian in hospitals, this technique allows us to understand the prognosis of a patient, or in other words, how the patient fare on the long term. And what's considered in a nutritional assessment involves body composition, the medical history, the psychological evaluation, which would probably be done by a consulting psychologist, and the nutritional evaluation of the patient's diet. This slide gives you a summary of the key body composition measurements that are currently used in healthcare. The first is the body mass index. It's measured by taking the weight in kilograms and dividing it by the height in meters squared. And I'm providing you here with a healthy range is. So it's 18.5 to 24.9. So it's good to keep that in mind. That's the goal you want your patients to reach. Now, the percent body fat complements the body mass index because the body mass index doesn't really measure fat. So the percent body fat measure is also singularly a good predictor of the level of adiposity or of fat on a person's body. So the healthy range for a man is 8 to 23% body fat, and a woman is permitted to have a higher percent, 20 to 35. Now, another measurement, the waist circumference, singularly predicts the risk of heart disease. And so it's important to keep that waist circumference under 40 inches for men and under 35 inches for women. I'll refer you to section 3.3.1 for body composition assessment in the textbook. This gives you a more complete understanding of the measurements in question. So next in the arsenal of nutritional assessments is the diet assessment. Now there are four basic methods that are quite popular. The usual food intake, the 24-hour recall, the food frequency questionnaire, and the actual food record. You could read more about these various assessment techniques in section 3.3.4.1, Assessment of Dietary Habits and Lifestyle, in your actual textbook. So I encourage you to read more about them, but I will use this presentation to talk a little bit more about the food frequency questionnaire, which I didn't have a lot of time to talk about in the textbook. As described by the Bertha Burke system of diet history, described earlier in the 1940s, this particular questionnaire is here to cross-check the quality that was actually measured in the 24-hour recall and the usual food intakes. So let's take a closer look at it. This questionnaire consists of a set of very standardized foods that vary in quantities sometimes in the hundreds and 200 types of foods. They're all very well organized by category, and it allows a systematic check of the foods with the patients, asking questions like how often do you have it, and it could be per day or it could be per week or it could be per month, or for example. It doesn't really measure the quantity of food consumed. This is presumably assessed when the 24-hour recall or usual food intake is actually considered. But the frequency questionnaire establishes the quality, the variety of foods that are actually consumed, and it's very helpful in getting a very thorough picture of what the patient is actually consuming. So a case study would be most appropriate this time in order to help you apply some of the knowledge that you've acquired in this lecture, and especially in the readings of Chapter 3. So it begins with a 27-year-old obese female. Let's take a look at her profile. The information of this case study is actually found in the textbook, so you can follow along as I review the highlights of this particular case. So the patient presents with a weight of 230 pounds. Her height is 5'10", and she's hypercholesterolemic, meaning she has high blood cholesterol. She has high blood pressure. She is suffering from depression, and she has an A1C of 5.9%. The ideal here is 5.7%. So the A1C is a measurement of the risk of hyperglycemia or of being a diabetic or a pre-diabetic. The treatment goal here is weight loss, about 10 to 20% of her current body weight. The physician wants to see improvements in her blood lipids, her blood sugars, and also in her BP or in her blood pressure. So that's the goal that's given to the nutritionist or the dietitian. So our assessment of the patient shows that the body mass index of this particular patient is 32.90 or 33. A measurement of her total body fat is 39% using bioelectrical impedance assessment, and her waist circumference is 44 inches. Looking at the body mass index table in your textbook, you can see that an individual that's between 30 and 39.9 percent is actually considered obese. And there are several categories here. So obesity class 1 is 30 to 34.9, and obesity class 2 is 35 to 39.9. And we can see here that a body mass index of 32.9 puts that individual as obesity class 1. Now, what about that waist circumference? So remember, the previous slides in the lecture indicated that we must know that for men, to have a lower risk of heart disease, the waist circumference needs to be less than 40 inches, and for women has to be less than 35 inches. So clearly, this woman here is at risk of heart disease with a higher waist circumference. Let's look at the diet assessment. Well, based on perhaps a 24-hour recall, usual food intake as well, we get an understanding that this patient consumes about 2,515 calories a day. Looking at the protein intake, probably from computer analysis, we get a protein intake of 6.7% of the DRI calories, and we know that the requirements, at least you should know, that protein's healthy range is 10 to 35. So clearly this intake is suboptimal. The carbohydrates are at 65.5% of the DRI. So because of this, they are considered excessive, slightly excessive, but nevertheless excessive. So it's over if 65%. Remember, the range is 45 to 65. The fat intake is excessive. The normal healthy range, you should remember, is 20 to 35%. Here we have a patient consuming 39.6% of her calories as fat, clearly excessive. What about the sodium intake? Well, the sodium intake is excessive. The computer analysis shows an intake higher than 2,400 milligrams, which is the upper tolerable limit. And then total sugar intake is also excessive because it's higher than 20% of the DRI calories. So before you can make dietary recommendations, you've got to consult the food record, and table 3.3 has a usual food intake record, and you can see the foods normally consumed by this individual. So quantities and types of food. So based on this record, then you're in a good position to make dietary recommendations. So here are the recommendations I recommend. So there should be an elimination of sugary beverages from the diet because it's quite substantive. Eliminate candies, gummy bears, and chocolate bars from the diet. Introduce 3 cups of 2% milk to the diet. Include high fiber food choices, starting with a high fiber breakfast cereal, and introduce a variety of vegetables to the diet. Now, milk is very important here because you can see that based on her dietary intake of sugary beverages, she was displacing milk out of the diet. So very little milk in the diet. So in order to ensure a good balance of all of her nutrients, milk definitely needs to be recommended here. So in order to come up with these dietary recommendations, I relied on the choosemyplate.gov food guide, which is recommended for individuals and for groups. And it's important to consider this guide as a standard to help you speak the lingo of good dietary habits. And so this is what I did fundamentally for this patient. I'm also deriving my recommendations from the nutrient analysis that showed that her fat intake was excessive, that she had excessive sugar intake, that her sodium intake was elevated, and this was indicative of excessive processed foods. And we can see that with the candies, also with a lot of bologna and processed meats and so forth. So these actually need to be gradually removed from the diet, in addition to ensuring preponderance of vegetables in the diet. Now that we have a sense of the dietary quality of the patient as well as the body composition profile, we can establish a healthy weight goal to attain and determine a rate of weight loss from caloric restriction only first, and then supplement that with prescribed exercise schedule, which will afford the patient extra energy expenditure for additional weight loss. So now I'm going to review the calculation steps for establishing the ideal healthy weight goal for the patient. Now, the first concept I want to draw your attention to is highlighted here. TBW is total body weight. And we have to understand that the total body weight follows a two-compartment model. It's equal to the FM, or the fat mass, plus the fat-free mass, or what we commonly refer to as the lean body mass. So given that this patient's total body weight is 230 pounds, we can replace TBW, total body weight, by 230. Now the fat mass represents 39% of 230 pounds. So we're able to establish what the actual mass is in pounds by multiplying 39% by 230 pounds. Consequently, we can now measure the fat-free mass. The fat-free mass, algebraically, now can be determined by taking the total body weight minus the fat mass. So here we are. Fat mass then is equal to total body weight, 230 pounds, minus the fat mass, which we calculated by figuring out 39% of 330 pounds. So mathematically, it looks like this. FFM equals 230 minus 0.39, which is really 39%, or 39 over 100, times 230 pounds. So this amounts to then 230 pounds minus 89.7 pounds, which is calculated from 0.39 times 230. So you just calculated the fat-free mass, 140.3 pounds. This is what we call the lean body mass. So consistent with the two compartment model, we can say now that the total body weight is equal to the fat-free mass of 140.3 plus the fat mass of 89.7. Both added together gives 230 pounds. So now we can calculate the desired total body weight, that's the goal total body weight, if we prescribe a body fat goal of 25%. If you remember, originally the patient had a body fat percent of 39%. So now, as part of our assessment and goal setting, we want to give this particular patient a percent body fat that is within the normal range for women. So we'll go back to that slide that looks at the acceptable healthy range for body fat. So we're selecting 25%. So this has to be determined in order to be able to calculate the goal weight. So now I want to group three calculations together. So again, let's look at the two-compartment model. The fat mass percent plus the fat-free mass percent should equal 100% in our new goal weight. Now, if we understand that the fat mass is equal to 25%, and we don't know what the fat-free mass is, that hasn't been determined, but because we know that the total weight is equal to 100%, we can figure out the percent of the fat-free mass. So simply, we take 100%, which represents the total body mass, and we subtract from that 25%, which we know is our prescribed fat mass or fat percent calculation, and that leaves us with a fat-free mass of 75%. So now, since we know that the fat-free mass is 140.3 pounds, that was calculated in the A section of the actual calculation, and we know that the fat-free mass cannot change with weight loss, for if it did, it would indicate a compromised health for the individual. So we don't want our patient, while they lose weight, to actually lose muscle. So we want them strictly to lose body fat. So consequently, it is okay and it is correct, good reasoning, to assume that the fat-free mass that you calculated in her obese weight will be the same fat-free mass in her lean weight. So we can therefore say that since the fat-free mass is 140.3 pounds, and since we know the desired fat mass of 25%, we can therefore assume that 75% of her goal weight, that is 100% minus the fat percent, will be equal to the actual fat-free mass, which we calculated, which remains constant, 140.3 pounds. So the equation reads 0.75 times GWT equals 140.3. So following the algebraic principles of multiplying factors, where one factor to cross over onto the other side of the equal sign can divide the number on the opposite side. So hence, because 0.75 is multiplying GWT, we can say that GWT then is equal to 140.3 divided by 0.75, which equals 187 pounds, which is the goal weight for our patient once she reaches down to about 25% body fat. So now we have to determine the type of restriction and strategy for weight loss. Now, in looking at the case study in your textbook, you'll realize that the patient's current weight is 230 pounds. So because we want to get her down to 187 pounds, that's 230 minus 187, so that means that she needs to lose 43 pounds. A dietitian would need to determine the rate of weight loss, or how many pounds a week she would need to lose. So mild weight loss of about a half a pound a week is encouraged, at least from diet alone, as it decreases the chance of a weight rebound or a weight regain. This means that the patients should undergo a 250 calorie a day restriction. So I'd like you to figure out how I came up with a daily restriction of 250 calories. So formulate it this way. If 1 pound weight loss occurs from 3,500 calorie restriction, calculate the daily caloric restriction needed to cause a half pound of weight loss per week. Pause the video here. So then if 1 pound loss is equal to a 3,500 calorie restriction, then we're asking the question, 0.5 pound loss would then be equal to X. X is then equal to 0.5 pounds divided by 1 pound, which is equal to, of course, 0.5 pounds, times 3,500 calories, and that's equal to 1,750 calories. So then if 1,750 calories are to be lost over 1 week, then that would obviously be equal to 250 calorie a day restriction. That's calculated by simply taking the 1,750 calories that we know are going to be lost over a week, dividing that by the number of days in a week, which is 7, and that gives you 250 calories. Now, in order for the patient to experience a greater weight loss of 1 to 2 pounds a week, which is a little bit more substantive and more likely to reach the goal of decreasing blood pressure and blood sugar and so forth in a timely manner, the patient will need to do exercise. This greater weight loss will satisfy, of course, the doctor's expectation and allow him to, or her rather, to come within the goals pretty expeditiously without encountering a strong, severe restriction in food, which causes a lot of hunger and a lot of uncomfortability. So our goal here is to make the patient comfortable. So now let's look at a method of integrating exercise for weight loss in order to complement weight loss already occurring from diet restriction. So if the goal is to cause in total 1.5 pounds of weight loss per week, including the dietary restriction and exercise, then this is the logic. So if 1 pound of weight loss is achieved with a 3,500 calorie deficit, then the total caloric deficit of 1.5 pounds would represent a 5,250 calorie deficit. This is achieved or calculated by multiplying 1.5 times 3,500. So the daily caloric deficit then would be 750 calories. I calculated this by taking the 5,250 calorie deficit, which would produce 1.5 pounds of weight loss, and I divided it by the number of days in a week. So now, since we established that the diet would be a 250 calorie deficit, then in order to achieve a total of 750 calorie deficit, it would invariably mean that exercise would have to represent 500 calories a day in energy expenditure. Now, if you consult a software like the MyFitnessPal, it can be shown that walking at a speed of 3.5 miles an hour expends 0.02875 calories per pound per minute. This kind of information is also found in human performance or sports nutrition textbooks. So then this means that at a weight of 230 pounds, and if she walks 75 minutes a day, she will expend 496 calories a day. How is this calculated? Well, 230 pounds multiplied by 0.02875 calories per pound will give you 6.1 or 6.61 rather calories per minute. When that gets multiplied then by 75 minutes, then the minutes cancel out each other from the denominator and the numerator, and you end up with 496 calories. So now the question of importance here and relevant to the patient is how long will it take this patient to achieve the weight goal? Well, here's the logic to follow. Since 1 pound of weight loss occurs with a 3,500 calorie deficit, then 43 pounds of weight loss would require 150,500 calorie deficit. How do I calculate that? Well, simply 43 pounds that are lost here is 43 pounds of fat. So we can multiply that by the number of calories associated with 1 pound of weight loss, 3,500 calories. So 3,500 times 43 is 150,500. Since the patient will be on a daily caloric deficit of 750 calories, it'll take 200.7 days to theoretically attain the goal weight. How did I calculate this? Well, I took the 150,500 calories, which were the total amount of calories associated with the total weight loss, divided it by the caloric deficit coming both from exercise and diet, 750 calories, and I get 200.66 days, or about 6 months. This is calculated by taking the number of days, 200.7, and dividing it by 365 days, and you get 0.55 approximately, or very close to a half of the 365 days, or in other words, 6 months. Well, let's try another case. A 38-year-old female weighing 350 pounds and has a height of 5 feet 8 inches. She's currently has a present body fat of 51%, and the dietitian has set her goal body fat at 22%, which is within the healthy range for a woman. Identify how long it'll take her to reach her goal weight if the dietitian prescribes a 325 calorie a day caloric deficit. So in this case, there's no exercise, only a dietary deficit. So at this point, pause the video and work on this case a little bit, and I'll reveal the logic of the resolution on the next slide. Okay, so you decided to peek ahead. So I'll give you the solution strategy. First, establish the patient's goal weight. Second, subtract the goal weight from the current weight to establish the amount of weight or the fat mass that needs to be lost. Third, transform the needed weight loss into calories. Hint, 1 pound of weight loss from fat is 3,500 calorie deficit. Fourth, divide the total fat mass calories by the daily caloric deficit in order to establish the number of days needed to reach the goal weight. You can then correctly calculate the number of weeks or months or years. So here's the solution. First, you need to establish the goal weight, and you should find that it's 220 pounds. Second, you need to subtract this goal weight from the current weight to establish the amount of weight loss or fat mass that needs to be lost. In this case, it should be 130 pounds. Third, transform the needed weight loss into calories. The hint, of course, is 1 pound of fat loss is 3,500 calories. So you really are multiplying 130 pounds by 3,500 calories. Now, in the final step, you're going to divide the total fat mass calories, which is 455,000, by the daily caloric deficit in order to establish the number of days needed to reach the goal weight. So the caloric deficit should be 325 calories a day. So you're going to divide the 455,000 by 325 calories a day, and that gives you 1,400 days, or divide that amount by 365 and you get 3.84 years. So I strongly recommend that students review the case and get to really understand the strategic steps and how to apply them, and then try new cases on your own of this same sort of type until you become faster, proficient, and more confident and timely in resolving these kinds of problems. So now I'm going to review the nutritional assessment steps that are involved in assessing an obese patient. So the first assessment step is body composition. And first we begin with the body weight, and then we do the body height, and from that we can establish the body mass index. Body weight in kilograms divided by height in meters squared. Then from the body mass index we can establish whether or not the patient is underweight, of healthy weight, overweight, or obese, and there are different classes of obesity, so students need to know that. Then you can look at the percent body fat, which is a very important component that can be determined by anthropometric measurements, and there are a variety of them that are covered in the book. Specifically in the body composition assessment section in Chapter 3. Using these various techniques, you can establish body fat percentage and compare that body fat percentage to healthy ranges. And here you're determining if the patient is over fat, under fat, or has a healthy content of fat on the body. And then finally the waist circumference, which is capable of establishing the risk for heart disease if the person is exceeding these cutoffs. So the goal is to remain under 35 inches for women and 40 inches for men. So in this second step, the student's going to assess the caloric needs of the patient using either the Garrier equation or the Mifflin equation multiplied by an activity factor. This represents really the caloric needs for weight maintenance of the patient, and it's used to prevent further weight gain and to ensure the adequate amount of calories are well known for weight maintenance. In this third step, you're going to do a dietary assessment. You're going to compare the carbs, protein, and fats, and you're going to compare them to the recommended macronutrient ranges, and you're going to compare the calories to the calories that were established using the Mifflin equation and activity factor or the Garrier equation. So by looking at the table, we can see that column 2 has the actual calories consumed, and the DRIs are the calories that were calculated and the nutrients cutoffs and recommendations that were calculated from the DRI calories. And if we look at calories, for example, we can see that the patient is consuming 94% of her recommended calories. And so because it's not less than 75% of the DRI calories, we can say that this patient's intake is adequate, even though it's slightly under. For carbohydrates, as soon as they go under the range, they're inadequate or suboptimal, and if they go over the range, they're excessive. Well, 293 grams is well within the 281 to 406 grams that were established, and if you remember, these were established using 45 to 65% of the DRI calories, 2,500. Now, the proteins at 150 are well within the range, and I'll remind you that that range was 10 to 35% of the DRI calories, 2,500. So at 150 grams, it's well within, so it's called adequate. Now, when we're looking at fats, 66 grams, we can see that the fat is also well within the 56 to 97 gram range, which was established using the percentages of 20 to 35% of the DRI calories. Now, when we go down to saturated fat, we know the cutoff there is less than 10%. 10% of what? Of 2,500 calories. Always use the DRI calories, not the actuals. So now if you've got saturated fat at 45 grams, clearly this patient is eating 161% of the cutoff, clearly excessive, so we can give saturated fat an E for excessive. What about polyunsaturated fat? Well, using 5 to 10% of the DRI calories, we can see that the range for acceptability is 14 to 28, and her intake is 10 grams. She's eating 71% of the recommended lower range, so she's clearly suboptimal. What about monounsaturated fat? Well, that's greater or equal to 11%, so that's 11% of 2,500, and that's equal or greater than 31 grams. She's clearly at 11 grams rather, or 35.5% of the cutoff. She's clearly under the cutoff, so here again she's suboptimal. And finally, if we look at sugar, we remember the cutoff for sugar is less than 20% of the DRI calories. So if we calculate 2,500 and 20% of 2,500 divided by 4, because sugar is a carbohydrate, we get less than 125 grams. Her intake is at 245, so clearly, what? 196% of the cutoff, so clearly excessive. So we give her an E for sugar. The diet analysis then goes into micronutrients or vitamins and minerals. And again, we're seeing in the second column the actual intake of vitamins and minerals and the DRIs in the third column, and the percent of the DRIs in the fourth column, and then our assessment in the fifth column. So if we look at calcium, we can see that the intake is 1,750, the DRI is 1,000, so the person is consuming 175% of that amount. Now you might want to go and see what the UL is for calcium, and I encourage you to do that because it is the UL and only the UL that will tell you if the patient is excessive. So calcium has a UL of 2,500 milligrams, I should say, and this intake represents the cutoff above which the risk of toxicity is high. Well, at 1,750, she's clearly under that UL, so there's no concern of her being excessive. So if she's not suboptimal and not excessive, she's therefore adequate. The magnesium at 122, and the DRI at 350, she's getting 34.9% of the DRI, and you remember the cutoff is 66. Anything at 66 or less, 66% or less of the DRI is considered suboptimal or at high risk of being deficient. Vitamin A, 2,800 micrograms. The DRI for a woman is 700. So this patient is getting 400% of her DRI. Sounds excessive, but remember, the excessive or toxic intake of a vitamin or a mineral can only be established if you consult the UL tables. So I invite you to go to the end of chapter 3 and to look at vitamin A, and you can see that the UL limit is 3,000 micrograms. So at 2,800, she's clearly under the UL. So even though her percent of the DRI is elevated, she is still considered adequate. What about vitamin D? 55 micrograms. The DRI is 15. So she's consuming 367% of the DRI. Sounds excessive. Let's go and check the UL for vitamin D. So as we go to the end of chapter 3, the UL is 50. And so consequently, we can say that at 55, she clearly is exceeding the upper tolerable limit of 50. Therefore, vitamin D gets excessive. Vitamin E at 980 milligrams with a DRI of 15. So this sounds like an outrageous amount, 6,533% of the DRI, but of course the intake is very high. But again, we're not going to conclude that the patient is excessive. We've got to look at the UL. So off to the table we go, and we look at the UL, and the UL is 1,000 milligrams per day. She's clearly under 1,000 milligrams per day intake. So even though the percentage is outrageously elevated, she's still categorized as adequate. What about thiamine? 5.4 milligrams. The requirement, or the DRI, is 1.1, consuming 400 and consuming 491%. So clearly we can say, well, is this patient really excessive? We've got to go and check. And what do you know? We don't find thiamine in the table. So because we can't find thiamine, it means that experts have not been able to establish an excessive amount or an excessive cutoff for that nutrient. And so consequently, without a UL value, the vitamin can only be considered adequate or suboptimal. So we give this one an A for adequate. Let's look at folate at 1,500, and that's micrograms, and then the DRI at 400 micrograms, 375%. Let's go and see what the UL is for folate. Folate has a UL of 1,000, so clearly, even though the percent 375 of the DRI is not as excessive as, let's say, the vitamin E, this folate intake is actually excessive. Let's look at niacin, 42 and 15. So 42 milligrams versus 15, 280% of the DRI. And for this particular intake, we're giving her excessive. Now, I like to note that the folate and the niacin together, these two, are considered excessive only because the intakes would have had to have been taken in from supplements, for example, or from fortified products. If all of this intake, the 1,500 from folate and the 42 from niacin, was only taken in as food, these nutrients could not possibly be considered excessive. But because they were brought in or consumed in the form of a supplement or a fortified amount in a food, then they can count as excessive if they go above the UL. So something to remember. The notation is indicated also at the bottom of the tables that are found for the ULs. Okay, I want to pause here and do a little bit of a review of the key things to remember at this point. First, non-severe moderate malnutrition occurs when calories consumed are less than 75% of the DRI calories. So what does this mean? It means a person whose DRI calories is 2,500, who consumes less than 1,875 calories, that person would be considered deficient or suboptimal in calories. That's the 75% cutoff. So you do the calculation to verify the number. Remember also that calorie intakes are excessive when they exceed the DRI calories by more than 25%. So again, a DRI calorie requirement of 2,500, a person who consumes more than 3,125 calories would be considered as excessive. That's 25% over the 2,500 calories. So do the calculation yourself to verify the calculation. Now remember also to consult Appendix 1, page 94 at the end of Chapter 3 for the micronutrient ULs, or the excessive cutoffs. And also remember to consult Figure 3.2, page 80 in the second edition to refer to the vitamin and mineral DRIs. They're found along column 3. The fourth step consists of prescribing a diet. So first, establish the healthy percent body fat. Determine the goal body weight based on that goal body fat. Then plan for a no weight gain period for about 4 weeks. Normalize the current food habits by introducing healthy choices. Gradually get rid of the junk food, the unhealthy snacks, and prescribe carbohydrates, proteins, and fat that are recommended and consistent with the macronutrient range recommendations. Then determine the caloric restriction, no more than a pound weight loss per week from the diet. Too fast generally means that there's going to be a regain afterwards. About a pound of weight loss from exercise in addition. And then determine how long it will take to reach that goal. So now I think it's a good time to try a little mini quiz. This is a training quiz, so it's not counting towards your final grade. In this first question, a man recently put on 24 pounds of fat over the last year. What will happen to his blood leptin levels? A. Leptin concentrations will rise, thereby causing a decline in his appetite. B. Leptin concentrations will rise, thereby causing an increase in his appetite. C. Leptin concentrations will fall, thereby causing a decline in his appetite. D. Leptin concentrations will rise, thereby causing an increase in his appetite. Or E. Leptin concentrations have no effect on appetite, but rather on controlling blood sugars. The correct answer is A. This is because leptin is directly secreted from the fat cells. So the more fat cells there are, the greater the leptin concentrations in the blood, and the more concentration reaches the brain, causing therefore a reduction in appetite. Second question, ghrelin levels in the blood will tend to increase when? Pause the video here, think about it, maybe research it in your book and come up with the right answer. I'll provide you with the answer right after. B. Stomach is empty and the person is hungry. This is when the ghrelin levels are elevated. When the person eats, the ghrelin levels then go down. The next question, a patient has a weight of 289 pounds and a height of 5 feet 4 inches. Identify below the patient's body mass index, or BMI. Pause here, do the calculation, and I'll show you the answer right after. The correct answer should be 49.65, or in other words, a BMI of 50. The next question, what happens to cholecystokinin, CCK, after a person ingests a large meal? Pause the video here, select your answer, and I'll give you the answer right after. The correct answer is A. CCK increases in the blood and causes the appetite to decline. Remember that CCK is part of the gut hormones. Next question, a 27-year-old woman weighing 278 pounds who has a height of 5 feet 6 inches is assessed as having a physical activity, or an AP, of 1.56. The body composition assessment indicates 42% body fat. Assess this patient's energy needs using the Mifflin equation and determine her goal weight if the desired body weight is 22%. So pause the video here and do your calculations. The correct answer is D. Her total energy expenditure, her TEE, should be 3,141 calories per day, and her goal weight 206 pounds. Here's another question. If a 27-year-old woman needs to lose 72 pounds, determine the extent of her daily caloric restriction if she intends to lose the weight over 1 year. Pause it here and do your calculation. The correct answer is E, 690 kilocalorie restriction per day. How did I complete this question? Well, first of all, 72 pounds need to be lost. That's 72 pounds of fat. Remember, 1 pound of fat equals to a 3,500 calorie deficit. So since there's 72 pounds, that's 72 times 3,500, and that equals 250,000 calories. Then that amount is going to be distributed over a year because she needs to lose those calories in a year. So that's divided by 365 days in a year, and the answer is 690. Next question. If a person walks at a speed of 3 miles an hour and expends 0.045 calories per pound per minute, how many calories will a 170-pound man expend per day if he walks 3 hours per day? Pause it here and do your calculations. The answer is D, 1,409 calories. Follow along, I'll do the calculation. So if the person weighs 174 pounds and they're burning 0.045 calories per pound per minute, we just multiply 174 times 0.045. That'll give us 7.83 calories per minute. And if they're walking 3 hours, that's 3 times 60, 180 minutes. So times 180, and you get 1,409 calories. Next question. If a person walks at a speed of 3 miles per hour and expends 0.045 calories per minute, how long will it take a 170-pound man to lose 53 pounds if he walks 3 hours per day at a frequency of 3 times per week? I'll recommend that you stop the video right now and do your calculation. Well, the first thing is we want to determine the number of calories burnt per minute. So we multiply 0.45 calories per pound per minute times 174 pounds, and we establish that the person will be burning 7.83 calories per minute. Next, we understand that this person works out 3 hours a day, so that's 180 minutes a day. So 7.83 times 180 minutes indicates 1,409 calories for a workout period, and they work out 3 times a week. So times 3, and that leaves us with 4,228 calories per week. So since this person needs to lose 53 pounds, and knowing that the loss of 1 pound is equal to the deficit of 3,500 calories, we can quantify the fat in calorie value. 53 pounds times 3,500 gives us 185,500 calories of fat on the body. Since the exercise is affording this person a 4,228 calorie a week deficit, if we divide 185,000 by 500 by 4,228, we get 43.87 weeks. Next question. If a person walks at a speed of 2 miles an hour and expends 0.038 calories per pound per minute, how long will it take a 234-pound man to lose 25 pounds if he walks 1 hour a day at a frequency of 5 times a week? Pause here and do your calculations. The correct answer is B, 32.8 weeks. Follow along with the calculation. So if the person weighs 234 pounds, so we multiply 234 by the caloric expenditure, so 234 times 0.038 calories per pound per minute. This gives us the number of calories per minute. Now, he walks 1 hour a day, so that gets multiplied by 60 minutes. So that's 533 calories a day, and he does it 5 times a week, so times 5. And that leaves us with 2,667.6 kcals per week. Now, since he needs to lose 25 pounds, the idea here then is that the 25 pounds of fat multiplied by 3,500 tells us that that's equal to 87,500 fat calories on the body. So if we divide that by the number of weekly calories expended, that would be divide that by 2,667.6, we would get 32.8 weeks. The next question, if a 27-year-old man weighing 302 pounds who has a height of 6 feet 2 inches needs to lose weight at a rate of 2 pounds per week, how much time does he need to walk at a speed of 3 miles per hour, expending 0.038 calories per pound per minute on a weekly basis in order to meet his goal if his diet restriction is minus 250 calories a day? So stop the video here and calculate the answer. The correct answer is D, 7.6 hours per week. Follow along as we resolve this problem. Now, we can begin by establishing the number of calories that this guy burns per week, and we can do that by multiplying 0.038 calories per pound per minute by his body weight. 0.038 times 302 gives us 11.48 calories per week. So let's hold on to that. Now, the next thing is that he needs to lose weight at a rate of 2 pounds per week. So we can figure that out in terms of an energy deficit. 1 pound is 3,500 calories. So 2 pounds is going to be a 7,000 calorie deficit per week. All right, now the next thing we know is that the diet is giving or providing a 250 calorie deficit a day. Well, that's interesting. So that's 250 times 7. So that's a 1,750 calorie a day deficit. Since the goal here is to burn really 7,000 calories per week in order to afford a 2 pound a week weight loss, and since the diet is providing, basically the deficit of 1,750 calories, we can subtract 1,750 from 7,000. That gives us 5,250. What is this 5,250? Well, it's the amount of energy that needs to be burned off through exercise. So now we can simply posit the following. Since the person is burning in his exercise 11.48 calories per week, we can say, well, the total amount of energy that needs to be spent is 5,250. So essentially, 1148 times the time factor, which is in minutes, needs to equate 5,250. So the time that we don't know is thus equal to 5,250 divided by 1148. And this gives us the number of minutes, 457 minutes. Since we're after hours, we just simply need to divide 457 by 60, and we get 7.6 hours in the week, per week. The next question. A dietitian wants to make the most accurate assessment of a patient's nutrient and caloric intake. What method of assessment will she prefer to use? Pause here and research your answer. The correct answer, the food record. The food record is held usually by the patient and records in real time the quantity of food, the type of food consumed, and also the location of where the food was consumed and the time. So it's a very accurate real time recording of the food, and the dietitian then takes those recordings and actually puts them into a computer software that analyzes quantity in order to get calories and micronutrients. Next question. The government wants to assess the mean caloric and nutrient intake of a large population. What would be the assessment method of choice? Well, the correct answer is going to be C, the 24-hour recall. Now, this hasn't been seen yet, so it's actually considered a learning moment for the student. What we know about the 24-hour recall is that there is not very much recall bias because of the recency. But the problem with the 24-hour recall is that it only does a sample of one day and may not be representative of that individual's intake. But when the 24-hour recall is applied to a large population, epidemiologists have been able to conclude that overall, when compiled together, the 24-hour recalls better represent the caloric and nutrient intakes of that population. If you experience difficulties in completing these questions, I recommend that you call me at my office, 507-389-5927, and I'll respond to you pretty promptly. And we could probably set up a meeting so that I can review these calculations with you. It's really important that students thoroughly understand the rationale, reasoning of these calculations so that they can effectively complete them in a very efficient way. Now let's take a look at a problem we just saw earlier. The 27-year-old man weighing 302 pounds, height 6 feet 2 inches, who needs to lose 2 pounds per week. How much time will he need to walk at 3 miles per hour on a weekly basis in order to meet his goal if his diet restriction is already giving him a 250 calorie a day restriction? I want to review this problem because there are probably some students that experience some difficulty, and so a closer look might help them. So first, determine how much weight can be lost from diet alone using the 250 calorie a day diet. So 250 calories a day multiplied by 7 will indicate that he will be burning 1,750 calories. 1,750 calories, divide that by 3,500, and you get that half of a pound will be lost. Subtract the weight lost from diet from the total weekly loss. Since the weekly loss will be 2 pounds per week and he's losing a half a pound from diet, that'll leave 1.5 pounds that will need to be lost through exercise. So the goal is to calculate how much they will need to walk on a weekly basis in order to lose 1.5 pounds per week. So now let's take a closer look at the calculations. So 1.5 pounds can be translated into calories. That's 1.5 times 3,500 calories. 5,250 calories will need to be burned. Now we've established that by multiplying his weight, 302, by 0.038 calories per pound per minute, that he burns 11.48 calories per minute. So 11.4 calories per minute times y minutes would equal 5,250. So it's an algebraic equation. So y minutes then equals 5,250 divided by 11.48 minutes, calories rather, per minute, equals 457 minutes per week. Divided by 60, you get 7.62 hours per week. So I strongly recommend that students now need to practice on their own similar problems in order to develop the swift, efficient reasoning in these kinds of problems. Make the mathematics easy and fun, but you can only get there by practicing them. And I recommend that. And I believe that once you try the rapid responses, they'll go a lot smoother.